Okay, so we're back, and now we're going to talk about the next major therapeutic technique that emerged following Freudian psychoanalytic treatments. The humanistic therapies were clearly a response to the techniques that Freud used and the assumptions that Freud made. The goals of humanistic therapy were to support your personal growth. So, whereas Freud had a goal of figuring out what you've got buried in your unconscious and cure you of whatever disorder you're experiencing, the humanists looked at it more like we're going to help you to become the best person that you can. And so, as a result of that, they focused on helping people to gain self awareness and, in turn, to gain self acceptance. The humanistic therapists were very devoted, struggling for a good word for that, to helping people become their best selves. And they thought that once they became their best self, then they'd be more likely to accept themselves, and in turn would be more likely to accept other people and would do better works in the world and things like that. I'm going to focus in this discussion on Rogers' style of therapy, which he called client-centered therapy. I like to focus on him because I focus so heavily on him in personality theory and talked about how he had that person-centered personality theory. He took that concept and applied it to therapeutic relationships. So let's talk about the techniques that are used here. And you're going to notice as I go through this list that Rogers was kind of just doing the opposite of whatever Freud advocated should be done. So, for one thing, Rogers thought that the therapist's personality was really important in the therapeutic interaction. And if you look at the things that Rogers thought was really important for the therapist to display, you'll notice that these are the same things that Rogers thought parents needed to display towards their kids so that their kids could grow up to be their best selves. So you need genuineness from your therapist, you need acceptance from your therapist, and you need to feel empathy from your therapist. Now, I'll name two modern famous humanistic therapists. And knowing that this is what their personality is supposed to be like, you might think, maybe I didn't know what these words meant. Because probably the most currently famous humanist is Dr. Phil. And if you've never watched his show, you should spend an hour, especially if he's doing a topic that has anything to do with a disorder. Sometimes he does more, because he's a humanist, he sometimes does more like interpersonal things. But if you watch an episode where he's talking to somebody who has one of the named disorders that we talked about in the last chapter, you'll really see his therapeutic approach emerge. For one thing, for good or for bad, he displays genuineness towards his clients. The other famous one, by the way, is Dr. Laura. She is, where I live, not really on the radio anymore. She had been, middle of the day on the radio for years and years and years. I think she's mostly moved on to satellite radio now because there's been some controversies and, things that come up when you're on advertiser support radio that she decided to move off, I think. But she also displays genuineness. Now, genuineness cannot be construed as niceness. I've given you two examples of therapists who, if you've heard anything about them, they are not known for being nice. Genuineness is not about being nice. It's about giving the client the impression that they know who you are, what you value, how you're likely to respond, that you aren't going to put on a face and pretend to be a therapist. You're going to actually act like yourself with knowledge about how to improve a person's outcomes. Okay, now this one you're really going to stumble over if you know Dr. Phil's history or if you know Dr. Laura's, this acceptance part. Because this one, I will agree, this is where they're probably the most shaky because they sometimes subscribe to sort of a tough love approach where they say, because they're so busy being genuine, they say things that can come off as judgmental. But if you listen and you understand humanistic psychology, you realize that they'll say the judgmentally sounding thing while making sure to let the person who's hearing it know that, okay, so a person who acts like this usually means these negative judgmental things that I'm going to say. But you being a lovable person who deserves better, should know better than to act like that. You can make better choices. You don't have to succumb to those impulses or whatever. So a lot of times it's a little bit buried, the unconditional positive regard, in what sounds like some pretty judgmental comments. And then empathy. Empathy, remember, is where you make sure that the other person understands that you realize you can put yourself in their position. And again, sometimes this seems like it's missing in Dr. Phil and in Dr. Laura, but if you listen to Dr. Laura frequently, or you watch Dr. Phil a lot, over a course of time, you hear them saying things like, I was in a situation just like that when I was your age, or when my kids were little, or when I was having to make a decision like this. They will sometimes say that. But they don't say it all the time, and that's where, when you're on TV or something like that, you can really get a misrepresentation about what humanism's about. In a therapeutic relationship, the therapist knows you haven't heard their spiel before. And so then they'll make sure to repeat things that are important to convey empathy to this individual person. When you're on TV or the radio, if you're saying it to every single caller, or you're saying it to every single guest, it may start to come off as kind of phony. And so, TV, the media portrayals are probably not the best ones, but I figure that way at least you know who they are, and maybe you could watch a show and get at least an idea of what humanism looks like. There are important changes in the therapist's demeanor that Rogers advocates compared to what Freud advocated. For one thing, to counteract that complaint that the therapist might not really be listening to you while you're laying on the couch free associating, Rogers recommended that the client face the therapist so that they can have eye-to-eye contact. And then the therapist needs to display active listening, needs to show the client that the therapist is hearing, processing, and trying to understand the client's perspective. And you'll notice I keep using the word client throughout this discussion of humanism, and it's actually part of the name of the therapy. Whereas Freud thought that you were a patient that needed to be cured if you came to therapy, Rogers and other humanists thought that you were a regular person who's just trying to achieve better outcomes for yourself, just like you're a client of your hair salon and they're just trying to help you to achieve your best hairstyle, or you're a client for a lawyer who's just trying to help you to, achieve the best outcome in the legal situation that you're in. A therapist in this school of thought tries to help you to become your best self. So through active listening. Now, sometimes on TV shows and movies, they depict humanists as being like parrots who the client says, "Oh, I'm so depressed. I don't even know why, I shouldn't just jump out of this window." And then they'll show a humanist saying, "What I hear you saying is that you're so depressed and you don't see why you shouldn't jump out the window." That's not what active listening is supposed to look like. If your client was to say something to you like, "I'm so depressed, I don't see why I shouldn't just jump out this window," the therapist is supposed to show their understanding of what the client meant by rephrasing it in their own words. So the therapist might say something like, "Well, it sounds like you've had a really stressful day. Would you like to tell me about that?" Or, "Wow, it sounds like you're really frustrated. Why don't you tell me what's going on? What happened?" So it's always a way to show what I got from what you said. One of the things that's really nice about active listening in everyday life is that if we say what we heard from what the person said, then we can give that person the opportunity to clarify what they meant. Because how often have you been in an argument with somebody who you love and cherish, but you're arguing over a misunderstanding? The speaker meant one thing and the hearer heard something else. So in active listening, you can say, "Okay, what I'm hearing you say is, fraught with all sorts of hostility. Is that really what you meant to say?" I just had an incident this morning where my husband said something that he did not mean in any kind of judgmental or hostile way towards my son. And my son just completely shut down and didn't want to talk anymore about what we were talking about. And my husband's like, "What? Now you're not going to talk?" And I said, "I think you're making him feel defensive." And my husband goes, "I didn't say anything judgmental." And I said, "Aspen, did it feel like you were being judged?" And he was like, "Yes, it does." It's sometimes the speaker doesn't mean what the listener gets. And so the listener, now in my husband's defense, the listener, my son, should have said, what I'm hearing you say is that you think I'm stupid, and is that what you meant to say? And then that would have given my husband an opportunity to rephrase. But when you're in a kid, parent relationship, you may not have that confidence. And that's one of the criticisms of client-centered therapy, is that the patient, the client, might have misunderstandings and may not feel comfortable asking the therapist what they meant, because there's a power differential in any kind of therapeutic situation. The other big thing about the therapist demeanor is that they need to be non-directive. And this is another area where it can be frustrating to be in humanistic therapy. Because if you came to therapy hoping that the therapist is going to tell you what's wrong with you and what you should do differently, that's not what's going to happen in humanism. That will happen in psychoanalytic theory, but that's not going to happen in humanism. Humanists view their role as sort of a sounding board for someone who's trying to work something out, that they need to come to their own decision. Humanists are very big on individuality and, the fact that different people might come up with different solutions in the same exact situation. And so the therapist's job is just to help a person to come to their own conclusions as effectively as they can. It can be really, really useful, especially if you have a person who really can verbalize what they're going through really well. If you have a patient or a client who can really verbalize their feelings and their reactions and do a lot of introspection, sometimes just through talking problems through, you can come up with your own solution. And that's kind of what humanists think their role is to sort of be there and give you maybe a little bit of probing, a little bit of, well, how does that make you feel? Or how do you think that'll make them feel if you make that decision? How are you going to make sure that people who are being impacted by your decision feel good about the way it's going, rather than making them feel bad? Now you have to fight about it. That's the role of the humanist, is to sort of cheerlead you through your own decision-making process and to give you skills and phrases and strategies that can maybe help you to navigate difficult situations in your everyday life. Humanism is probably not going to be very effective for something like schizophrenia, but it works really well for like anxiety disorder, or probably more so for like mild depression than for full-blown suicidal ideation kind of depression. Mostly you'll find humanists as like life coaches, things like that, because they're really good at that kind of situation. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll come back in the next segment and talk about behavior therapy.